Throughout the lifetime of Final Fantasy XIV, it is hard to think of a character who has been more polarizing than Zenos. Many critics would point out that his major problem is that his motivations pale in comparison to the complexity of other villains. This ends up making him come across as a pretty formulaic and inconsequential villain. Not only this, his fascination with the Warrior of Light is difficult to make sense of, and adds a bit too much spotlight onto the player character. I think that many people of this mindset had some apprehension as time went on and it was revealed that his storyline had not concluded in Stormblood. I was certainly of this opinion myself. Having undergone a change in character design, I had expected that he might come into the next expansion with new motivations that would rise to the complexity of the narrative that would unfold. However, I was quite surprised by the time that he was reintroduced in earnest. He seemed to have not changed at all. But then the pieces of the story started to fall into place. Despite him not changing his motivations, the thematic developments of Endwalker changed the circumstances of the narrative such that the story as a whole could benefit from the consistency of his character. In this video today, I will be talking exactly how Zenos transformed from antagonist to a thematic antithesis in Endwalker. Zenos doesn't quite seem to fit in with the themes of Stormblood because he mostly serves as a contrast. The expansion centers around revolutionary group identity and collective sacrifice as opposed to individualistic pursuits of power and vanity. This is portrayed thematically from the outset through the establishment of the expansion's first major antagonist, the Griffin. The reason that the Griffin maintains anonymity is to reinforce the significance of his ideology over his personal identity. More directly, he is able to rouse the Alamegan refugees to his cause by citing the power which exists within all of them as a collective call to action. Once again, he is attempting to rally around the establishment of a group. This is why it makes so much sense later on when it is revealed that the Griffin is actually the former captain of Alphinaud's Crystal Braves. One of the largest contributing factors to the failure of the Crystal Braves was Alphinaud's naive inability to separate his vanity at playing savior from the ideological purpose on which the company was established. We see that Ilberd is the polar opposite, choosing not to rely on his former status, but rather a grassroots approach to raising an army. Each soldier is there for the intent of reclaiming Alamigo, and they remain loyal because there is nothing to distract them from this goal. Because of this, Ilberd's army willingly treads into ethically ambiguous territory by conducting a false flag operation at Balzar's Wall in order to reignite the war between Eorzea and Garlemald. They do this without hesitancy because their individual culpability is masked by the purpose of the group. It comes as a surprise not long after this when Zenos appears on the battlefield standing distinctly from the rest of his army with no thematic significance in his leadership. We can only assume that his army follows orders out of fear, which is not a tremendously compelling quality for an antagonist. The execution of his introduction is made even more messy through his fight with the Scions, or rather, the lack thereof. FF14 until this point had done a great job of showing that tremendous sources of power are coupled to significant sacrifices. Using Ilberd again as an example, we see that the only way he can present a challenge to the Scions is by forfeiting himself to the power bestowed by the Eyes of Nidhogg. Similarly, a threat on the scale of Bahamut yields massive casualties for both sides. To see Zenos come in with seemingly no limit on the power at his expense disobeys the established rules of the story. It makes it all the more unreasonable when he doesn't follow through with wiping out the Scions. After all, he should know at this point that these were the same people who miraculously thwarted Gaius in the Ultimate Weapon. Typically, this sort of storytelling is used to gauge the threat level of a newly introduced antagonist. Done correctly, this can provide necessary context to their abilities. Done poorly, it conveys little meaning beyond spectacle. Even worse, it renders the subsequent journey of the protagonist to train and meet the power level predictable. Zenos consistently justifies sparing the Warrior of Light by acknowledging their potential to grow into somebody that might challenge him. As the player, we aren't given any reason to understand how we could know this without breaking the fourth wall and recognizing that the Warrior of Light plays the role of the protagonist. As the story progresses, it is made abundantly clear that Zenos is driven solely by the motivation to face a worthy challenge in single combat. His goal stands at odds thematically with the rest of the story in Stormblood, because there is no reason why a supposedly threatening, highly intelligent military commander would do something so compromising as to jeopardize his nation for personal glory. He doesn't have to prove himself to anybody. His army already fears him and respects him. Meanwhile, we see that the opposite is true for Hien and Lys. Both are forced to take drastic actions and make tremendous sacrifices to achieve victory and raise their army's morale. When we finally fight Zenos in the conclusion of Stormblood, the battle plays itself out predictably. The Warrior of Light triumphs, and Zenos is satisfied to have been defeated by somebody that he respects. It would seem that Zenos has reached the natural conclusion of his motivation, which raises the question, what is the purpose of bringing back Zenos for Endwalker? What could he possibly add to the story? To my surprise, despite an underwhelming presentation in Stormblood, the significance of his unrelenting motivation to live for the thrill of battle is a tremendous boon to developing an antithesis to nihilism as it is explored in Endwalker. Nihilism is a philosophical view pertaining to the fundamental aspects of human existence. Early dialogues of nihilism argued for the negation of hegemonic social and moral structures as well as aesthetic thought. More contemporary understandings of nihilism stemming from Friedrich Nietzsche focus largely on deconstructing the notion of a grand design and the affirmation of human life. The most common representation of nihilism in media, and which is represented thematically and imagistically in Endwalker, is existential nihilism. According to this subset of nihilistic philosophy, life is without intrinsic value, meaning, or purpose. I won't go too in-depth to summarize how this is explored in Endwalker, since I plan on covering this in a future video. But it suffices to say that Meteion is forced to accept the truth of existential nihilism as a logical resolution when questioning the meaning of life, only to encounter ceaseless suffering and the vast silence across the cosmos. So how does this connect back to Zenos? As I've mentioned previously, Zenos doesn't seem to perfectly fit the mold for the themes which Stormblood was trying to convey. He is self-serving without consequence and has no connection to sacrifice. His one defining characteristic is that he possesses an unrelenting desire to face stronger and stronger opponents. It is for this reason that he lives. Therefore, he exists as an antithesis to Meteion's promulgation of existential nihilism. Moreover, insofar as he can be considered a villain by some measure, it proves that purpose is not necessarily good by its very nature. When Alize confronts Zenos on his principles during their encounter in Garlemald, it is the first time we see him reflect on his ambition as something to earn and aspire to, rather than something that he has the right to take.
Zenos! Perhaps you found meaning in living this way. I cannot deny you found strength. Yet if you only pursue your hedonistic pleasures and pay no heed to the plight of others, then no one will give you the time of day. You will never get what you want, not even the battle you pine for so dearly. You'll be alone for an eternity, and you'll deserve every agonizing second of it.
This is such a wonderful scene because it speaks directly to the dual nature between Zenos and the Warrior of Light. While Zenos seeks power to triumph over the Warrior of Light at their peak, the Warrior of Light seeks power to overcome Meteion in the final days. Therefore, it follows as a logical conclusion that the necessary condition for fighting the Warrior of Light at the height of their power is the prevention of the final days. In typical Final Fantasy fashion, might does not always make right, which means that defeating the principal antagonist in this case is not only necessary on a combative level, but on a philosophical level as well. The Warrior of Light confronts nihilism through an affirmative will to power as described by Nietzsche, which is summarized as follows. If we affirm one single moment, we thus affirm not only ourselves, but all existence. For nothing is self-sufficient, neither in us, ourselves, nor in things. And if our soul has trembled with happiness and sounded like a harpstring just once, all eternity was needed to produce this one event. And in the single moment of affirmation, all eternity was good, redeemed, justified, and affirmed. What this means is that instead of viewing misery and suffering as a tragic inevitability as Meteion does, thereby necessitating deliverance from pain as mercy, one could just as readily accept that these hardships exist to manifest our will to power. Therefore, they exist for the purpose of being overcome in order to affirm our existence. This in turn affords us opportunities to explore our ever-evolving growth on a personal and cultural level. The reason that Zenos appears in this fight to render aid is to affirm himself as the Warrior of Light's equal, and in doing so, live up to his ambition. The natural conclusion of his ambition is achieved following the defeat of Medion, and he has finally earned the right to challenge the Warrior of Light to single combat. The reason this is such a perfect end to the main story of the expansion in Zenos is because it aligns the thematic significance of the central characters through conflict, and in doing so, it resolves its message. This brings me to the end of the video. If you walked away with something, I would greatly appreciate it if you could drop a like. I'm still ramping up production on this channel, so a little bit goes a long way. If you have your own thoughts, I would very much look forward to continuing this discussion in the comments. Take care everyone, and I'll see you again in no time at all.